Hey you listening? Your favorite unit and character sucks. And that's fine. I'm not talking about character writing, of course. I'm mainly talking about their performance and whatever generally applies. And in this scenario, it's probably going to be heroes. If I wanted to get into character writing, which, to be quite honest, I never really want to do on this channel, that's going to start up way too much stuff than what it's really worth. But back to the main topic at hand. Your favorite character is not good, and that's okay. Barring roughly maybe 2 or 3% of the entire cast of Fire Emblem heroes, most of them just exist. But my favorite unit is meta. Well, here's a list of my favorite characters. Eat shit. And even if they're good right now, they're not going to remain good forever. I'm looking at the Reinhardt fans specifically. Huh. And why am I bringing this up? Well, I needed a video for today. But in the other partial honesty, I've noticed over the course of who knows how long at this point, here's a general number that probably doesn't even apply. A general shift in unit perspective and cynicism when it comes to unit viability. And that's something I kind of get, especially with all the power creep that's been pushed throughout the game in easily the last year or two. It's been a lot. And on one hand, I completely get it. Waiting for a favorite or a character you like to get in, or they get some sort of new addition, and they basically end up being another coat of paint to a previous unit, aka they're kind of just whatever, they're generic, they don't really do anything in particular. I get that. It's not really the best feeling. On the other hand though, with the amount of tools and resources that we do have in the game, you can realistically make even the worst of units usable, and that will only continue being the case as the game goes on, which in my opinion is really nice. Even if the ceiling for each archetype and unit differs by a considerable amount, it is worth noting that it's only been in recent times where pretty much every single archetype can function within some form. Back then, it was pretty much a death sentence to be a ranged flyer, for example, especially if they didn't have a PRF. A lot of the ones, even with PRFs, just weren't good because of the archetype they found themselves in. And now it's a death sentence to be a melee infantry. Mostly kidding. But really, outside of Arena, where the only important thing is BST, you can pretty much make most things work at this point. With a bit of support, of course, and I'll get into that in a bit, but that then really begs the question of unit identity, because to get a lot of these units to function nowadays, you kind of have to give up what makes them unique, at least if it's applicable. Whether or not they have a PRF that's outdated, but you kind of want to keep it because you're kind of stubborn, I get that. Or if they're generic, and at that point it doesn't really matter. But you do have to weigh the option of, do you want to make them function, or do you want to make them unique? For example, I think a lot of people look at Brave Ike as somebody who used to be really, really good, and now looks at him as somebody who's really out of his element. And a lot of the time, you can pretty much just argue that a lot of the other inheritables are strictly better for whatever role you want to put him in. You got Acts of Devotion, which is just free chip damage, and that could also help secure kills. But you also have Threma, and that's just an incredibly busted inheritable axe for all intents and purposes. So really, if you did want to make him function, for example, you just give him Threma or some other inheritables, because it does take them out of their current limitations, but it will remove what makes him stand out. You know, even though he just doesn't really stand out regardless, because he just instantly dies with Irvan. That being said, both cases are valid enough. At least from my perspective, I use Odin's old tome because I think it's really cool looking and it at least gives him something. Even though the tome is just extremely awful and there's a good chance he'd function way better with any sort of arcane. And really, I would say that applies to most units nowadays. A lot of the ones that have access to arcanes or decent inheritables are going to be able to function within some relatively decent niche, even if they aren't necessarily the cream of the crop when it comes to it. I think the only archetypes that really suffer in that regard are some kind of beast, whether that's like beast infantry or beast flyers or whatever the case may be. And that's mostly because a lot of them may have outdated weapons that they can't really replace because beast limitations are haha funny, I guess. But no matter what path you take, whether you want to keep them up to date or you want to make them struggle as much as possible with their outdated PRF, they're going to need support no matter what. And I'm sorry to say, but no matter what kind of unit you are, you're going to need support in some capacity. Even the best units in the game use support, and that's most likely not going to change whatsoever. But the supports don't need support? They're the support units themselves? Well, they need to support other non-supports, and in some capacity, that makes them the support units to the support units. So, shut the fuck up. I think it's something that I believe more people just kind of need to accept at this point, because nowadays everything just kind of goes crazy berserk, even the supports themselves, but a lot of the units really go out of their element because of the extra additional push they get from characters that may grant pulse support or like statuses such as bonus doubler or null panic or whatever the case may be. Sure, some of the efforts may be due to whatever support was tacked onto whatever coat of paint, and sometimes other units will need more support than others, but it is your favorite coat of paint, which in my opinion should make it more fun for you at the end of the day, regardless of how much you gotta throw at them. Although I will say, depending on whether or not you want to keep these old weapons on these old units, sometimes you may just need even more support than whatever the case might be. And again, it might just boil down to the fact that you just want to really keep their unit identity, and I have honestly all the respect for that, especially since one of the biggest things that came out of the Arcane era was the issue of homogeny and pretty much every single unit doing more or less the same thing. Because it's kind of hard to look at a lot of these inheritables and go, yeah, why would I run this really old rancid sword when this new one eclipses 90% of the PRF ones? And even for a lot of the newer ones today, it's kind of ridiculous in some aspects. But even that aside, it just becomes another big issue of unit identity and whether you want to keep them around in a bygone era or just kind of make them function. Because realistically, you can make every single unit work in the game. It's not really going to be that difficult, but obviously the ceiling for performance is going to shift dramatically depending on what you're using. A Merlinus can be decked out, but it's not going to do the same work as something like Winter Yunaka, but you can make them work if you really, really want to. And I think that's what it really boils down to. I think there will be a need for adapting eventually. It doesn't matter what unit it's going to be. Maybe they'll still want to keep their PRF over whatever inheritable they could get in the future, because you could definitely argue it's better than whatever other options they have available to them. But that's not going to be most units, unfortunately. And even for the ones that want to keep their PRF, they're still going to need to adapt in some capacity. Whether or not it's going to take a bit of effort or a lot of effort is entirely on the player trying to make their favorite unit work. Sometimes you will lose. Maybe even more than sometimes. Maybe a lot, because you're a fucking loser. This also applies to people who use meta units a lot, by the way. It's not just the people using the old ones. But in my opinion, that just makes the times where you do win with your old favorites way more satisfying. So I say, just have fun with it. The game, at the end of the day, is all about having fun. So what you need to do to make that happen is entirely on you. Whether it takes a buttload of effort or a little bit of effort or maybe some new inheritable weapon or a new skill or whatever the case may be. If it's for your favorite, I think it's totally fine. And I think really outside of maybe like the 0.1% demographic of characters that are very, very meta and will probably remain meta for a long time, I think you don't really have to worry about most units just keeping up or being bad or whatever the case may be, because at the end of the day, they're your favorites. And you know, it at least beats complaining about stuff that won't change. So do what you need to do to have fun. And hey, if your character just so happens to be extremely meta and they're your favorite, then I mean, I guess this video really isn't for you anyway, but that's okay, because I know somewhere out there, somebody is a massive, massive fan of Duo Leon. Brave Dimitri counters Valentine's Leon. The end.